Harihi Om. Om Shrim Hrim Klim Ganeshwaraya Brahmaswarupaya Jarave Sarvasiddhi Pradeshaya Vigneshaya Namo Namaha Vam Agajanana Bhatmatkam Gajananam Maharnisham Anekadantam Bhaktanam Ekadantam Upasmahe. Om Jnananandamayan Devam Nirmalaspatikhakrtim Adharam Sarva Vidyanam Hayagrivam Vasvahevam Gurut Brahma Gurut Vishnu Gurudevo Maheshwara Gurut Sakshat Parabrahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Gurave Sarva Lokanam Visaje Bavaroginaha Nidaye Sarva Vidyanam Sri Dakshinamurtaye Namaha Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Dakshinamurtaye Namo Namaha Om Sahanao Bhavatu Sahanao Bhunaktu Sahavedyam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditamastu ma Vittvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Jnanamurthaye Namo Namaha. Om Sai Ram, and welcome back to week 2 of the Upanishads. If you remember or you recall, last week I started with a background to the Upanishads. That means where the actual location or placement of Upanishads is in terms of the entire layout or structure of the Hindu religion or the Hindu philosophy, because Hinduism is more than a religion, it's a way of life. Hence it is called Sanatana Dharma, which is eternal righteousness. I mean, that which is right eternally, which is followed and, inculcated in day-to-day life. So I spoke to you about the 4 Vedas, the Rig, Yajur, Sama, and Atharvana. Then I told you the Upavedas. Then I told you the 4 parts that each Vedas has, right? The Brahmanas, the Samhitas, the Aranyakas, and finally the Upanishads. The Brahmanas and Samhitas, if you remember, I said are one category. And of course, the Aranyakas and the Upanishads are another category. And I also said the Brahmanas and Samhitas make up the Karma Kanda, which is based on action, rituals or practices or knowledge that is action-oriented. Then I told you Aranyaka and Upanishad moves you from the basic worldly practices into the higher altitude of, intelligence, which is the Jnana Kanda, right? Therefore, you can start. It's all very well and good to start with the Karma Kanda, but then one has to elevate oneself from the law of ritualistic practices to the role of intelligence, right? I mean, how you can go within and seek intelligence. Karma Kanda is going outward, but going outward in order to prepare yourself sufficiently, adequately, or appropriately in order to go inside. Go out to go in. Just like the breath, breathing in, breathing out. So you breathe out all the desires and you breathe in all the discipline, right? So that's the background. Then I told you that, what are the little components, what are the contents, sort of around the time they were written, all this is a rough indicator, right? No one knows the exact time because there were no records. I told you there were 2 methods by which these were received. One is Shruti, purely by hearing, and the other is Smriti, by divine sight. So that's how they have been collected, right? And as I said, last week was the introduction or the introductory part. Today we move on to the first Upanishad, which is Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, right? It's recorded to be the oldest amongst, all the Upanishads. And then, obviously we'll take one Upanishad a week from now on. So this week is Brihadaranyaka. Next week will be Chandogya. I'm saying so that if you want to do some research, you can. And remember what I said about research, only primary sources of information, reliable, not just web-based information. Right. So if you go back to the, creation or the actual historical bit. And the first question that comes is, when was this written? Well, it was not written. It was, as I said, received through Shravanam, Mananam, and Nidyadasanam, right? That means either you've heard it and then through the hearing you have a vision associated with it, or you envision something and then you listen to what you are envisioning, and from there you also learn. So it goes back between the 9th and the 6th century BCE. Of course, I'm sure most of you know that all the little abbreviations before a timeline, like you have BC, you have AD, and then you have BCE, right? AD and BC are kind of connected. BC is called before Christ, and AD is usually referred, after death, or if you want the Latin equivalent, it's called Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, right? That means, from the time Christ died, the Gregorian calendar began to, associate itself with days, dates, weeks, and months and years, but not before that. Of course, BCE is a slightly later, which obviously has a shorter version of history, before Common Era, BCE, before Common Era. And normally it's from the 15th, 16th century onwards. So this was written well before the time, right? And who you always associate or dedicate a piece of work to someone, right? Of course, the person who put the entire Vedas together, compartmentalized it, is of course the great Maharishi Vyasa, right? Vyasa Maharishi. But all the Upanishads have got, contributors, individual contributors, or significantly contributed by a rishi or a couple of rishis. So as far as the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is concerned, we have Rishi Yajnavalkya. Yajnavalkya is the one who is given importance as far as the content of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is concerned. And it's, there are two types. Upanishads can be looked at from two perspectives. One is a Mukhya Upanishad, or significant or important, or the other one is Amukhya, which is superficial or not as important. So of course, I'm looking at all the Mukhya Upanishads, right? And the Veda, which this particular Upanishad attaches itself to, is the Yajur-veda. And remember, I said to you last week, Yajur-veda has got two divisions, right? Shukla Yajur-veda and Krishna Yajur-veda. So this Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka, deals with Shukla Yajur-veda, right? Right, okay. And it's part of the Brahmanas. Brahmanas, as I've told you last week, are commentaries or prose. When you take something and you comment on it, this in Sanskrit is called as a Brahmana, right? Of course, the other meaning is, one who is born into a Brahmin clan is called a Brahmana, right? But the more accurate reference to a person born into the clan is a Brahmin, not a Brahmana, because a Brahmana means a commentary or an analytical prose, okay? Now, how many chapters, how big is this Brihadaranyaka Upanishad? Well, it's got 6 chapters, and each chapter has got number of verses, right? They can be divided into, parts, part 1, Brahmana, part 2, Brahmana, part 3, Brahmana, like that. There are many. You remember when I did Bhagavad Gita with you, remember I said to you, chapter 1 has got, 79 verses, and then I took some verses and, we went through that. So in the same way, right, what I'm giving you is, because we won't have time to go through every single chapter and every single verse in the chapter, right? That may take years. So as I always say, I'm taking the collective fruit, and the fruit is called Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. I'm putting it in the blender and I'm making a juice. The juice obviously is the extract of the fruit that I put inside, and I'm giving it to you to drink. Okay, so enjoy the nectar, right? Don't ask me from where you bought this fruit, which shop, what is the expiry date. All that is unnecessary and irrelevant knowledge. All you have to do is, having drunk it, you say, wow, this is madhu, this is honey, This is Amritam. And Amritam gives you enjoyment, gives you bliss. That's called Amritanandam, right? So the philosophy of this Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is twofold. One, it looks at Atman, and then it says Atman is Brahman, right? Right. Now, Brahma, Brahman, in between there is man, and if he doesn't realize that, if he doesn't move from Brahma to Brahman, then he is Brahmam. Okay, you see, a simple alphabet makes a distinction there. Brahma is B-R-A-H-M-A, Brahma. But from the form Satguna, you have to go to the Nidguna, which is Brahman or Atman, right? B-R-A-H-M-A-N. Now I've added the word N. That is the ultimate. From a form into the formless, from conscious into complete consciousness, Brahman. But if you don't realize that in this birth, obviously there will be Punarjanmaha, you know, Punarapi Jananam, Punarapi Maranam, yeah, again birth, again that, Shankaracharya. Then you are Brahmam, B-R-A-H-M-A-M. So it is your choice whether in connecting with Brahma, you remain with an M at the end, Brahmam, which means no life, right? Ashakti, no life. Or you convert that into an N and you realize Brahman. And that is why the central verse, you see, every Veda has got a verse, right? Yajur-veda, 4 Veda, Rig-veda, Yajur-veda, Sama-veda, Atharvana-veda. Each Veda has got a Mahavakya. A Mahavakya means the Veda completely rolled into one word or two words. So the 4 words are Aham Brahmasmi, Tattvam Asi, Prajnanam Brahma, Ayam Atman Brahma. For every Veda is represented by one. So Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is connected to Yajur-veda, the central Mahavakya is Aham Brahmasmi. Aham means the true me is no different than Brahma. Brahma asks me. I have the capacity to become that one supreme Brahman. And that is why the focus of the philosophy of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is Atman and Brahman, right? And many great authors and teachers and acharyas have commented. The two, obviously, the two greatest, I would say, scholars are, of course, Shankaracharya, and one in the lineage of the Ramanuja lineage, Madhvacharya, yeah, Madhvacharya. So if you look at the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, you know, it is one of the principal Upanishads, and it is like the first Upanishadic scripture in Hinduism, right? So from, if you compare it to the, you know, chronology of the 108 Upanishads, so like I said, it's it goes back, right, between 900 and 600 BCE. But of course, some parts have later been added on. You must remember, right, going back then, if only everything was, you know, passed down through listening and through hearing, through listening and through seeing, then there was no record. So naturally, there must have been, as the time progressed from the great rishis to normal human beings who then became teachers, there must have been a slow and gradual dilution and erosion of the significance of what was transmitted through sight and through sound. So later editions, of course, people have looked at then what was slowly records were being kept, you know, then people said, okay, let us write something on, you know, this Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Chandogya Upanishad, this, that. So when man started to write it, I'm talking about modern man, right? Post 15th century. They started to write, and of course, you know, some things were transposed into other Upanishads. There's a crossover, there is a, you know, an overlap, that sort of things you will find, right? But principally, it relates to one thing. You must propel yourself from just being a Jivi to the Atmi, right? That hence Jivatma, Paramatma, Atman, Brahman, Parabrahman, like that. It talks about those kind of things. Okay, and I said, Aham Brahmasmi. the central focus of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad at least is Aham Brahmasmi. So if you ask about chronology, then you must understand chronology really is difficult, something very difficult to resolve because of all the, for want of a better word, right, scanty evidence that we have, right? So I said scanty evidence because you cannot go to one point of resource and say, so here we are. This was done in 967 BC or whatever the case may be. You can't. You get some references to some years, and then other places you get other references to other years. Hence, the various opinions that contributed to the final of what we see today called Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, it rests on scanty evidence. And if you look, if you analyze things like archaism, archaic stuff, style, the way in which the text is written. Of course, every age, the way they write differs, right? English in Shakespearean time and modern English, the prose differs, the meanings differ. And of course, in the modern times, we don't talk Shakespearean language. If you read, people will think something is wrong with you. So in the same way, how records were kept, how they were written then is not the same way it's kept and written now. Now you have Wikipedia. Anyone from any part of the world can go and change stuff in Wikipedia. So if you put, I saw a red dog, someone can go and change the red to brown. Someone can go and change the dog to cat. So it's even more scantier now because it is so easily accessible and editable. And that's why I said it's very important that your source of information is one, reliable, and two, independent. Okay. So if you look at the archaic style of writing, if you look at repetitions, these are all driven by assumptions by people who have contributed over periods of time, because they themselves didn't have solid evidence. So they look at a few things, they come up with their own ideas, their own thoughts, their own interpretations, and they write that. Mostly, the Western scholars like Max Schopenhauer, Paul Deussen, all these people, right? They have written vast amounts of literature on the Upanishads. Much more, I would say, much more than the Upanishads themselves, right? So if you look at Brihadaranyaka, and my research shows that there is a considerable overlap between Chandogya Upanishad, Kaushitaki Upanishad, and some parts of it also reflect in Isavasya Upanishad. And I will cover this when I look at those Upanishads specifically, right? So instead of thinking what is the exact year or what is the exact century as to the creation of this Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, all you need to know is it is the oldest Upanishad, one among the first, right? And it has got, some collaboration or corroboration with Chandogya Upanishad, and of course, one or two other Upanishads. These were all living documents. There was a text somewhere, probably inscribed on a stone, probably inscribed on a leaf. And with over time, these things are not kept or preserved, we lose them, right? And that's how we've lost the majority of the great heritage of our literature, right? So keeping it is very important. As a knowledge, keeping it is not important. As a knowledge, practicing it is important. So you see the clear difference there, right? Once you get the knowledge, no point keeping it. You have to practice it and you have to disseminate. Then you will grow, right? Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Brihad and Aranyaka, right? So when you join them, it's called Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Brihad means great, big, huge. Like you have the great Shiva temple in Tanjavur or Tanjore, right? Called the Brihadeshwara temple. Brihadeshwara means, Brihad means great or big or huge or massive or humongous, right? And of course, Ishvara means Shiva. And true enough, if you go to this temple, and I've been many times to this temple, there's a huge Sivalinga there, right? And on top of the Gopuram, right, the tower, there is one huge boulder, circular boulder. It's one complete boulder which weighs, I don't know, maybe 500 tons, right? And this was built during the Chola and Pandya Raja kings, or 7 generations of kings, they built this temple, right? Now, what sort of technology do you think they had at that point in time to build such a huge, great temple? And the Shivalinga in there is huge, right? Is huge. And all the biggest of man who stands in front of that Shivalinga appears minute. That is to show that as a jiva, you are little. But once you merge into the greatness of this Brahman, Atman, then there is no difference between you and me. As long as you see the difference, there is no merging. Once there is merging, there is no difference or distinction. So Brihat means great, right? So to give you an example of what that means, I gave you the temple called Brihadishvara temple in Tanjavur, right? So Brihadaranyaka, as I said to you, is forest. So Brihadaranyaka means the great wilderness or the great forest. And I also told you the idyllic settings that you get in the forest, where you can just sit, and in the stillness of the forest, you can go into the sounds of the greatness of your mind, and therein find what you are seeking, right? So it was obviously, as I said, it is credited to sage Yajnavalkya or Yajnavalkya Rishi. But then, subsequently in later years, and more so in modern times, it has been refined, right? These are called, when you revise something, it's called a recension, right? It's called a recension. Now, as I said, it relates to Shukla Yajur-veda, okay? It has 6 adhyayas, as I said, or 6 chapters in total. And we'll go through each one of the chapter, and I'll give you, a summary of the chapter and extract the importance or the significance of that chapter. So the whole Brihadaranyaka Upanishad has got 6 chapters, but it can be looked at from 3 khandas. Khandas are books, right? Madhu Khanda, Madhu is honey, right? Khanda is chapter or book. Muni Khanda, Muni is Yajnavalkya, Rishi, or Kila Khanda, right? So you can look at the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad's teachings from the Madhu Khanda perspective, from the Muni Khanda perspective, and from the Kila Khanda perspective. Okay, so different chapters will link up with the different khandas. Okay, for example, if you look at the first and the second chapter of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, it relates to Madhu Khanda, and each khanda has got several brahmanas, prose, commentaries, analysis with varying number of hymns, right? That's where probably it may get confusing for people who think, so much of information here. Which one is relevant? Which one is not relevant? So if you're looking at the hymns give credence to the explanation proposed by the commentary, right? So you may find 6 hymns, 7 brahmanas, 9 brahmanas, like that. Don't get confused, right? Go finally to the crux, and that's what I'm giving you here. So the first 2 chapters deal with Madhu Khanda, then the others deal with the Muni Khanda, and of course, the final one deals with Kila Khanda. And brahmanas, as I said, means prose or commentaries or analyses or an examination, which then someone writes what they have found. So let us look at the 6 chapters. The first chapter, what does the first chapter relate to, or what does the first chapter contain, right? The first chapter, it talks about Prajapati. Now, from a Puranic perspective, Prajapati is the son of Brahma, the first created by the creator in the lineage, right, of man. Prajapati is the father of man, so to speak. So, of course, he was created from the creator himself. That's why he's called the son of Brahma. So the DNA is the same, right? So if you're talking science and physics, let's talk DNA. DNA of Prajapati is exactly the same as DNA of Brahma. So from the creator came creation, from the creation came man. Man is related to creation, creation is related to creator. At the end of the day, if you draw one line, it is synchronicity across the 3 concepts. It says, in the beginning, there was nothing. I also told you that the Bible starts like that, right? In fact, the Quran also says the same thing. In the end, there was nothing, and then the Creator breathed. It says Creator, right, without any specific reference. Whereas in the Bible, in Christianity, it says the Lord. In the beginning, there was the Word, and the Lord said X, Y, Z, right, like that. So Prajapati was created from nothing. And when, upon creation, the universe was also born. And Brahma gave it life. It's called prana. So when you breathe life, breathe life, in temples, especially when you go and do this consecration ceremony, what they call as Kumbha Abhishekam. Kumbha is, at the top, and Abhishekam is the absolution ceremony, right? So it's called a consecration when a new temple is built, or 12 years after the first consecration. Every 12 years, they have to be like a charging the battery, so to speak, right? It's called prana pratishtabhanaha. So whenever you install a new deity, you have to breathe life into it. And this is done by mantric vibrations, right? Pranayam yamha, like that. They say different mantras to imbue life into the statue. So the statue becomes alive, right? Statue becomes alive. Alive here means, it doesn't have the same faculties like you and me. It doesn't have your jnana kandas, it doesn't have your jnana kriyas, your karma kriyas. It doesn't have sense of organ, sense of perception, sense of being, all it doesn't have. But the energy, the vibrations is there. That is why you go around the temple, and you will always see that the mula, the mula sthanam, or the sanctum sanctorium, always is never flat, is always raised a bit. You got 2 or 3 steps, and then you go, and then the God is in there. And when you go around, check this out. If you go to the temple next time, right, your waist will be in the same level, or should be the same level, as the base of the Mulasthana, your waist. Why waist? Because the Muladhara chakra is there, right? The base chakra, right? Of course, the Muladhara chakra contains something called Kundalini Shakti, right? Maybe, sometime in the new year, we can have another session on that, on chakras. So when you go around, there is so much of vibrations inside because of all the, absolutions, all the mantras and all the chanting that goes on. So when you go around, your body is walking around the sanctum sanctorium. You are actually linking up with the vibrations and absorbing the vibrations. That is why I have said, thousands of times, when in the temple, just speak in silence to the gods. But I've never found this in reality. It is so much of noise already existing in your mind, and as though that is not enough, we talk, we do so many things, children running, making noise, all those things. So noise on top of noise, and in that, in that clarion that is the noise around you, you are trying to find some silence. Just imagine if you walk into a temple, there are hundreds of people in there in complete silence. That is how temples should be, right? I have stopped going to temples. You know why? Because why should I go outside when he lives within me? So I close my eyes, right? In all these years, we've been to hundreds of temples, especially when I go with my brothers from, Malaysia. We go to the Sabarimala Yatra. We go to numerous temples, right? Before we hit Sabarimala. Numerous temples. And I tell you, I close my eyes. I can go to any temple and do the exact physical actions that people who are actually there are doing. That is how powerful your mind is. But no, we will take a flight. We will take a bus, take a train, and hire a car, and we'll go to that place and do the same thing. When you have been given the capacity to realize that very spiritual energy by just shutting down. That means closing your eyes, and rebooting. That means owning the switch inside, switching it on. This is the focus of the first chapter. It is telling you creator, creation, man. Man must use creation to go back to the creator. Very simple. Outward, right? Pravritti marga, and inward, nivritti marga. That's what you have to do. Non-dual monistic metaphysical premise, right? Non-dual monistic metaphysical premise that Atman and Brahman are one identical oneness. And this is the central focus. You see, excuse me, the soul is the imperishable one that is invisible. And it is imperishable, but you cannot see it. Can you feel it? Well, you speak as though you can feel it. You know, one day, some time ago, I was talking to someone and they said, you know, I do that for a living and then I do this for my soul. I said, huh? Can you explain, you know, where is your soul in the body? I asked. Just like I always ask, you talk about mind, mind, mind. Where is the mind in the body? Is the mind an anatomical part? The brain is, the heart is, but where is the mind? So similarly, the soul is what you are all about. And the purpose of this life is for you to realize that soul through yourself. That means from the I, you take out the I equals self, you take out the I, then only the self remains. And that is why it says the self conceals in self. And as long as one is entrenched in the reality of the external world, one cannot realize the true self. That's very clear. Right? So that is what the first chapter talks about, you know, in the various Brahmanas and in the different hymns. Right? Same thing, but said in a different way. Atman and Brahman equals one identical oneness or identical oneness. The second chapter, if you like, it's a conversation between, you know, Ajatashatru and Gargya, right? Now, who's Ajatashatru? See, the earliest references in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad talks about this, right? The discussion between Ajatashatru and Gargya. Ajatashatru was the king of Kashi, ancient Kashi, right? And he had a little thought one day. He says, what is this, you know, everybody is talking about Brahman or Atman or being, the supreme being. So he says, who can explain this concept to me, right? And he offered, you know, 1,000 cows. In those days, you know, the number of cows that one possesses represents one's extent of wealth or well-being or, you know, materialistic power. So he says, I will give 1,000 cows to anyone who can come and explain the concept of being or Brahman to me. So people said, oh, we can't, but you can ask this, you know, Gargya. Gargya. So Gargya was a normal man who used to, you know, pray every day and live his life according to the dharmic demands of right conduct, truth, and, you know, unconditional giving. So he lived, and people thought he was a very, very intelligent man who had a good idea of what life was all about. And they thought, you know, given that premise, he should also have a good idea of what a being is or what Brahman is. So Gargya was called to the king's court, and the king said, apparently you are able to understand and explain the concept of the being, you know, the supreme Atman or the supreme Brahman. So, you know, anytime you are ready, you can start. And of course, as promised, I will give you 1,000 cows. Gargya looked at the king and he said, the person within the sun is the being, but the sun is also the being. And the king stopped him. He said, 1 minute, I asked you to explain what the being is. So don't talk to me about the being. Explain it. Explain it. Then he said, the being. So Gargya looked at the king. He said, which part of you, O king, is alive? Is it your head? Is it your heart that is beating? Is it your hands that move? Or your legs that take you somewhere? Is it your eyes that see? Is it your ears that hear? You know, is it your nose that smells, your mouth that speaks, your tongue that tastes? Which part of is alive in you? Every part is alive, but you are referred to as a being, and that being is given a name. So that being, that same being that is, completely labeled as King Ajatashatru, is also labeled as the moon, is also labeled as the sun. Hence we have the adage in the Rig-veda, Chaksho Suryo Ajayatha Chandrama Manaso Jataha. The mind is equated to the moon, and the eyes are equated to the sun. Pranar Vayurajayatha. You talk about the Panchabhutas. He says this same being that is in the sun, in the moon, in the universe, pervades in the space, in air, in fire, in water, in sound, in the mirror, in the shadow that shows from the mirror. Everything is the being. When you think that you and the being are separate, and you will always remain unattached. But when you think you and the being are one and the same, that means that acceptance must apply to everything that you see in life. Right? Like when you greet each other, you say Sai Ram or Hare Krishna or Jai Shri Krishna. Right? That means you're saying in me that this divine presence is there. So the other person is also responding to you. Sai Ram, Jai Shri Krishna, whatever, Hari Om. He's also saying that energy is also living in me. So it is the recognition of the identity of that oneness, and that is the being. The king, he was happy with the explanation, but he was not satisfied. Right? If you remember, in my reflections, I think last Thursday or the Thursday before, I looked at happiness, and then last Thursday I looked at contentment, and I differed between the two. Right? So the king said, no, you have to explain further, because I am not understanding. I like what I hear, but I don't understand it, and I'm not satisfied with this. So Ajatashatru took him and he said, come with me. He took Gargya and they went outside the castle, and he saw one person sleeping. Right? So he said, this person is sleeping, right? How does he know what he is when he's sleeping? When this person fell asleep, this is Ajata, the king is saying, right? His consciousness has enveloped all his senses. So when he's sleeping, he cannot taste, he cannot touch, he cannot hear, he cannot speak. Well, unless you speak in your sleep, that's a different thing, right? And, if he's dreaming, his consciousness takes him there. And then when he wakes up, that is gone and he is back here. So how do you distinguish between the two? And Gargya said, have you seen a spider weaving its web? Is the web already present for the spider to move? He asked the king. The king said, no. The spider moves along the thread that it itself has woven from itself. So where does the thread come? It comes from within. So it creates it weaves the web, and then it walks on it. As it walks, it weaves. As it walks, it weaves. He says, just like sparks come out of the fire, and that spark can become a fire, and from that fire, spark can become a fire, there is no distinction, therefore, between, as long as there is breath. Even if he's sleeping, he's breathing still. I remember there's one part where I look at, I think it's Isa Upanishad, where I talk to you about the meditation side, the dream, the sleep, the deep sleep, and of course the Turiya, the awakening stage, right? That comes in a later stage. So that's why they are all like developmental, The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad introduces a concept, and then the Chandogya builds on it, and then the Katha builds on it, and then the Keto builds on it, like that. They're all connected yet independent, right? Distinct yet kindred in some way. So he says, just like the spider moves and weaves its web and then uses what it has weaved to survive, so too, mankind must understand that this world is true, And the being is the truth of that truth. That means there is nothing else apart from the being. And it is, sometimes they say, don't be in the past, don't be in the present, be in the future. Being in the present is what you need to do on a day-to-day basis. Because even if you think 5 years ahead, you cannot live that 5 years ahead until that 5 years materializes itself, isn't it? And even if you think, I should have done this 2 years ago, you cannot go back and correct it. So the being means being one with yourself and being in the present. That's why present, present, is also called a gift, isn't it? Right? So that is the second chapter. It looks at things and it says, not this, neti, 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 not this, not this, not this. So what am I? Right? What you are is the true being, the true essence of yourself is you are Brahman. That is why in Mahabharata, Krishna told Arjuna that, isn't it? He said, Arjuna, I know my journey. I know where I have been, what I have been, for how long I have been. Right? You, the difference between you and me is you also have done many journeys like that. But I know the history and the timeline. The difference is you don't, because you are not one with your own being. Mahabharata sheds light on the Brihadaranyaka like that. Not this. Are you this? No. Neti. Neti, neti, neti. Neti means not this, not this, not this. Shankara said that, when he was talking to one of his disciples, and he asked his disciple something, and the disciple said this. He said, neti, this, neti, this, neti. I give up. That is what you need to do. When the Shishya said to him, I give up, he said, that is exactly what you need to do to find your true being. Give up the I. Not I give up, but give up the I. And latch on to the A. Because unless you leave the I, you will not get to the A. I means myself. A means Atman, one self. Okay, so that's, if you like, that relates to the Madhu. That is actually an Amritam. It's telling you this is actually very simple, right? Rather than show you a tree which has got, bees and honeys on there, I am telling you, look, this is Madhu I'm giving you the extract. So drink and enjoy, everything. So it's telling you about oneness, right? I mean, we say the prayer, isn't it? I'll come to that later towards the end of this talk, right? But just to draw relevance, Samasta lokha sukhino bhavantu. What does that mean? May all the beings in all the worlds be happy. So it's just not talking about human beings, isn't it? It's just not referring to human beings. So all the plants, the animals, the life forces, it's called the Jiva Pranas in the Bhuloka, the Jiva Pranas in the Bhuvaloka, the Jiva Pranas in the Suvaloka. So you're saying, may all the beings comes again, beings in all the worlds be happy. Because only when you're vibrating on a happy note does your mind become rested. So everything, organic, inorganic, animate, inanimate, everything has got energy. And I think I told you the story about, how one Swami called a group of people to come for interview, and the last person to walk into the room, he just shut the door with a bit of a loud bang. Swami called him and said, everything is energy. Everything is cosmic energy. Open the door, say sorry, and shut it properly. So the Brihadaranyaka says everything is connected. Everything is connected, right? It's just like what do you call that? When you open an electric box, you will see all the circuitry, isn't it? All are connected, and therefore that connection affects each other. Organic affects inorganic. Inorganic affects the organic, right? If one takes honey and is able to contain the honey and process the honey within his body, he's fine. But if one is ill at the same time, for example, if you have diabetes, then one cannot take honey in as much the same way as the other person who has not got diabetes. So everything therefore is connected, right? That which is dependent is actually independent, but man becomes dependent on that so much that his dependency does not rise and become independent, right? So if you look at, it's called a synthetic unity of perception. And once you transgress that synthetic nature, then you go into the true nature or the natural nature, right? And one part of the Upanishad also talks about all the other rishis who are connected. So as far as the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, it names, it's called Veda Vamsa. It's called the Vamsa, means lineage, or, the what we call the Parampara, right? So there's 57 Vedic scholars who have contributed to what the Madhukanda has become, right? The third chapter is, so far I've only done 2 chapters, right? And I'm trying to synchronize everything into a condensable summary for you. The third one is a metaphysical dialogue between 10 sages. This is just one chapter in the great forest of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So on the day, and they spoke about 3 things. These 10 rishis in the third chapter are being referred to as speaking about the reality, the Atman and Mukti. Mukti, moksha. What does that mean? Right? So they spoke about how in reality the Atman must be given the right food so that Mukti draws closer. That is why they say, Jivan Mukti, Jivan Mukti, Jivan Mukti. That means, whatever you do, the Jivan will not get Mukti unless you feed the right thing for the Jivan, isn't it? You in a hospital, the hospital is singular. The doctors are all qualified in the same way, right? Of course, their specialisms may be different. So you have 1,000 patients. The 1,000 patients are not going to be given the same medicine, the same injection, the same treatment, isn't it? Yes or no? Same hospital, same doctor treating 10 different patients, but he doesn't give the same treatment. And this is what they're talking about. The reality is the Atman of every individual Jivi, that's you and me and everyone else, every single life being, must be given the right food for it to grow out of the condition, right? If you keep giving it the wrong fruit, it will grow in the wrong way and it will have anti-consequences, right? And this work, this chapter of Yajnavalkya, what he has done in putting this chapter together, has been compared to the modern writings of Socrates. If you have read Socrates, and if you've read one particular work of his called, the Dialogues of Plato, this is exactly what they talk about. It's Greek philosophy, but it's 100% reflecting chapter 3 of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, right? So that tells you how ancient this book is, right? It also talks about the connection, of senses. So it talks about 8 combinations of graha and atigraha, right? That means what we call sensory action, graha, and atigraha is senses. Sensory action and senses. For example, it talks about 8 combinations. It talks about breath, which is the sensory action, and the sense is smell. So breath and smell, speech and words or noise, or ideas, tongue and taste, eye and form. Whatever the eye sees, it gives you some sort of formation. Ear and sound, skin and touch, mind and desire. How perfectly they have captured this mind and desire. That's why, throughout, when I did Bhaja Govindam with you, when I did Bhagavad Gita with you, when I was talking about karma, when I spoke about Ramayana early this year, I said only one thing that is central theme throughout all these great works. Desire the mind from desires. Then you're free, right? Desire, the key culprit, the criminal in every thought of yours, right? Desire. And then, of course, he says, you must learn to control your graha and atigraha. Graha is sensory action and atigraha is the sense. So as the sensory action is breath, the sense is that of smell. Like that, mind and desire, so focus on that. So what you see, what you hear, what you speak, and what you think. If that you can control and bring to one line of synchronicity, then you are fine. What about the fourth chapter? The fourth chapter, it talks about our great king, Janaka. The conversation between Janaka and Rishi Yajnavalkya. And then it explores the theory of the soul. Does this soul exist? The theory of the existence of the soul. It's phenomenal manifestations of the soul, philosophical implications, soteriology, it talks about all of this. And it says, this is Janaka. Janaka was a great rishi who became a king, compared to his counterpart, which is Vishwamitra, was a great king that became a Brahma Rishi, right? Like that. And both are connected in Ramayana to Rama, right? Janaka, of course, was the founder of Sita, and Vishwamitra was Rama's, right? Veda Guru, Shastra Guru, right? Ashta Shastra Guru, anyway. So this conversation between Janaka and Yajnavalkya spoke about 6 things in particular, where it relates to the soul. And the soul can manifest in 6 ways. So what are the 6 ways? Well, they say prajna, consciousness, is one way in which it can materialize. Priyam, priyam means love, or prema, right? Priyam, prema, same thing. Love and the will to live, so that by living you can help others. That is also representative of the soul. Satyam, reverence for truth. That's why the Rig-veda says, Satyam vada dharmam chara, speak the truth, always act righteously. Ananta, endless, endless what? Endless ability to always help others. Relates to the truth. From this Ananta comes Ananda, which is the 5th, right? So what have I said so far? I said to you, prajna, number 1, priyam, number 2, Sathya, Satyam, truth, Ananta, Ananda, and Sthiti. Sthiti means the conditions of living. Ananda is bliss, of course. So from consciousness, from prajna to priya to Satya to Ananta to Ananda to Sthiti comes creation. When this is observed and executed in this way throughout your life, then you will be brought closer to your soul. And it will be easier for you to say, Neti, not this. Neti, not this. This is the principle, not this, not this is the principle you should apply in your own life, in your own journey to understanding what is your soul all about. Remember, all of us come with a history that is directly linked to our karmic account. So the soul does exist, and that is collectively agreed by everybody, right? Including the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which I said Upanishad is the crest knowledge, the crest jewel of knowledge. So the final thing. And when you can understand and appreciate that in that context, that's it, you merge, right? Indescribable knowledge and history the soul comes with, right? And that is why they always say, your life, which you put so much of importance on, is only like, not even 0.2% relevant to what the soul brings and to the evolution of the soul. Because the moment you die, the moment the breath leaves, prana, the moment that prana leaves you, exits you, that prajna is dead. Then only the soul continues, isn't it? Right? That is why, when I've been asked to explain the concept of death, in some funerals, and, purely for the purposes of, knowledge and awareness, I do that. I said, stop, crying for the person who's dead. Instead, pray for the soul to continue its journey. 3 buckets of your tears is not going to do anything for the dead body, because at the end of the day, it's going to either become dust or bury it in the ground and become one with nature. So why are you shedding tears for something that is naturally going to become a natural thing. Instead, look at what is going to happen to that soul and pray for that soul. And, this chapter talks about that, and the modern, Max Muller, Schopenhauer, and Deussen, in their respective translations or, in their respective books about the Upanishads' view of the soul, the self, and whether there is liberation or a state of existence after death. They speak about this, and they said, no, the soul has got no death. It lives and it continues to live, and it lives as a spark, and it lives as the flame, and it lives as the fire. Therefore, in which level we are, right? Mostly at the level of the spark. So the soul is imperishable, unattached. That's why the moment the breath leaves, it is the soul that travels. The breath is a very karma thing. It's a practical thing, isn't it? You breathe and you don't have breath. How do they check if someone is alive or not? They check for breathing, isn't it? The person is no longer breathing, they say, well, he's dead. And they give a time of death. So on and so forth. So Brihadaranyaka Upanishad talks about the soul, right? The last two chapters, as I said, talks about the Kilakanda. The first two chapters talk about Madhukanda. The second two chapters talk about Yajnavalkya Munikanda, right? And then the last two chapters, 5 and 6, talks about Kilakanda. Kilakanda is supplementary or additional, right? It's sometimes like what we refer to in research as appendices or appendix, right? So this talks about, what happens, when a person who's living dies, right? And how life is created and how life ends. This is the 4th and the 5th chapter, is to give a bit more explanation to the first 4 chapters, right? So to give it a bit of meat, they've added this 5 and 6, and see how life is born, grows, and then dies. And, the role of the soul throughout this process. This is the 5th and the 6th. But if you look at what has the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad given us, right? Then I can tell you that karma, the theory of karma has evolved through the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Of course, it has also existed, as I said, in the Itihasas, namely the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and the Mahabharata. But one of the earliest formulations of the karmic doctrines occurs in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where it was doctrinated. The concept as existing in practice was seen in the Itihasas, namely Ramayana and Mahabharata, but as a doctrine, it became encapsulated in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. You think ethics is a 20th century thing? No. This is another concept that has come out of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, right? It tells you 3 things, the 3 Ds, D, D, and D. D for Dhamma, self-restraint. D for Dhana, charity. And D for Daya, ethics. Because it's not a legal injunction, isn't it? It's a moral injunction. Anything moral is ethics, ethical. So it's you have to be ethical. You have to have self-restraint, Dhamma. You have to have Dhana, Dhanam, give Dhanam. Dhamma, Dhanam, and Daya. Daya means Daya. Daya karo Shiva Ganga. Daya comes in so many bhajans, isn't it? Compassion. So Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is a manual of ethical concepts. Fantastic. You can take that. This is the extract, the essence. And then it also gives you the yamas. For example, in Yoga Sutras, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad gave rise to Yoga Sutras through the Rishi Patanjali, right? So what does it say? It says, if you want to evolve yourself in the yoga, science of yoga, and again, I've spoken about this before. I said, you talk about yoga, you have to talk about Ashtanga yoga. Ashtanga yoga means 8 parts, 8 stages, right? Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi. Right? And we only talk about the 7 stages, which is dhyana. Now, you cannot go to dhyana if you haven't mastered the 6 steps before dhyana. So In Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, it refers to the yamas, the niyamas, the asanas, the pranayama, the pratyahara, the dharana, the dhyana, and then it talks about samadhi, where you become one with the one, where you become one with the one. And the oneness then does not distinguish between the past, the present, and the future like that. So it talks about ahimsa. Ahimsa here, of course, as I always say, it's nothing to do with a physical thing. Right? It's to do with thoughts, words, and actions. The thoughts have to be ahimsic, your words have to be ahimsic, and of course, your actions have also got to be ahimsic. Right? Sathya, restraint from falsehood, always maintaining the truth. Brahmacharya, until, of course, you get married, and then, this concept in as I said to you, it talks about ethics, right? And you get the 10 commandments in Christianity, and one of it is fidelity, isn't it? Thou shalt not covet another man's wife or husband or that sort of thing. It's also addressed in this part of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. In the appendices, it talks about brahmacharya, which is, fidelity, or not being infidel. Not being an infidel. Then it talks about aparigraha. Aparigraha means, greed, restraint from avarice. You become avaricious or possessive. So it's fantastic that these are modern things that, the Brihadaranyaka talks about. It also talks about psychology. Actually, if you read the language, there are references to something which now modern psychology refers to as psychometric evaluations. Then itself, we have already got this, What is the different theories pertaining to psychology and human motivations? This is already there. The desire for progeny, life. Behavioral theories linking action to nature, suggesting that behavioral habits make man happy. Like some people get happy when they smoke, some people when they're sad, they are smoked to become happy. So behavioral habits are directly connected to the state of mind of man. This Brihadaranyaka Upanishad already said then. And now you get, people who speak about behavioral theories talking about the same thing, right? And karma, I said to you, if you do good, you become good. If you do bad, you become bad. As you do, you become. Swami has said that. God, if you think of God, you are. Dust, if you think of dust, you are. As you think, you become. Yat mano tat manushyaha, yat buddhi tat buddhaha. Like that, the same thing. So, even Shankara has commented on this. Shankara, in his commentary on Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, talks about the relationship between the consciousness, the mind, and the body. He talks about these three things. So it's really fantastic when you read, go through this. The mind actually creates the desire. How? It uses the eyes. If the eyes does not see, it does not want, it does not wish for, So the eye is the cause of material wealth, because it is through the sight that wealth is created. And so says the Upanishad. It is through the ears that desire is further propitiated. So that's why we say, listen to the right thing. Shravanam is the first stage of bhakti, And there's also reference to the dialogue between Yajnavalkya and his wife Maitreyi, where Yajnavalkya says, you don't love something for the sake of the object. You love something for the sake of the subject. I mean, it's just fantastic, And if you want to know, if you are a scientific or a practical or a realist in life, then I invite you to go and analyze the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, because it talks about metaphysics. It talks about metaphysics, i.e. Advaita, non-dualism. You look at something, it shows you something, but if you look beyond it, it is something else. Advaitam, right? So it moves you, from unreal to the real. Hence the prayer we have, right? So it talks about the universal reality and the consciousness, and that which links them is something called infinity. That's fantastic, metaphysics. The nature of the reality or self is described as consciousness bliss. When you are vibrating at that level, you don't distinguish between good, bad, pain, pleasure, day, night, same. You are the same, right? So that is what we should aspire to become. So the last two things I want to make note of as far as the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is concerned is the two prayers, the great prayers that has come out of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which we all recite, right? So now whenever you recite, you know, this prayer has come from this Upanishad, right? Everybody says, isn't it? The Purnamadha, Purnamidam, Purnat, Purnamudachyate, Purnasya Purnamathaya, Purnameva Vashishyate. That Brahman, Purnam Adham. This Brahman, Purnam Idham, Purnat Purnam Mudachyate. That infinite universe that comes from the infinite Brahman, you know, is one infinite coming out of another infinite. Purnasya Purnamathaya, when you take them in collection, you know, in a state of collectiveness, then there is no difference between what was existing and what was extracted, because when you join them, they become one. That is the infinite. Purnameva Vashishyate, they become one. Like, as I said to you earlier, man has come from, you know, creation. Creation has come from the creator. Man through creation must go back to the creator. Purnamada, Purnamidam, Purnat, Purnamudachyate, Purnasya Purnamathaya, Purnameva Vashishyate. I am one with that oneness. Right? And this is the reality of the being, the nature of infinite and consciousness and bliss. It's one line if you draw across. And this is the cosmic energy that integrates the microcosms and the macrocosms, i.e. the individual microcosm and the universe macrocosm, right? Metaphysics, solid metaphysics in the Upanishad, right? And of course, it also gives you the Pavamana mantra, another famous gift for mankind from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is the Pavamana mantra. Pavamana mantra, you know, Asattoma Satgamaya, Tamastoma Jyotitgamaya, Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Right? From the untruth lead me to the truth, or from the unreal lead me to the real. Untruth and unreal are same, real and truth are the same, right? Darkness lead me to light, death lead me to immortality. Now, of course, if you move away from the physical plane of the explanation and go into the spiritual plane or the intelligence plane, then it tells you, you know, what does asat thoma, asat to sat? What does this mean? Well, asat, let go of your own ignorance that blocks your vision, and of course it precludes you from seeing the ultimate truth, and reside in the state of the all-knowing and all-understanding, from unreal to the real, untruth to the truth. Because only when you do that, you can go to the second one. Tamastoma Jyotirgamaya. Right? Jyotir means light, specifically where darkness is meant as negativity or ajnana or the absence of wisdom. So only when you can, you know, when you have captured or mastered the first line, asattoma satgamaya, then you have the qualification or you have the quality to go to the second line. Then only you can go from tamastoma to jyotir. And once you're in the light, mrityorma amritam gamaya. Don't give me this birth again. Don't give me this birth. Let me merge one and become Brahman. So when I merge, there is no difference between the I that once was and the Brahman that I have become. And that is why after we say this, we say Shanti 3 times. One is for the physical self, one is for the mind, and one is for the universe, right? 3 gunas. One is for the each guna, you say Shanti is 3 levels of peace. One is for the Bhuloka, one is for the Bhuloka, one is for the Swaloka. Like that, everything has a meaning, you know. Just because we don't reflect on the meaning, it doesn't mean that the meaning is not there. It doesn't mean that it does not mean what it is meant to mean across the time. And of course, constant repetition or mechanical repetition is karmakanda. Karmakanda. And I said to you, use karmakanda as a stepping stone to launch yourself into jnanakanda. You know, your journey has to begin somewhere. Right? And of course, so many people have begun to give, you know, literary comments and commentaries, or if you look at Shankara's Brahma Bhashyas, or Bhashya Sutras, he talks about all this. And, you know, there is no shortage of, you know, Western literates as well. many of them have come and they've looked at these Upanishads and they said, well, if you take all the Upanishads collectively, right, it gives you three main sort of, categories or classifications. One is Advaitam, or non-dualistic, or monism, right? Then he says the Upanishads also talk about Dvaitam, dualistic or theism. And then, a mix between the two is called Vishishtadvaitam, right? Qualified non-dualistic approach. Dualistic approach, non-dualistic approach, and then a marriage between the two, Vishishtadvaitam, right? Qualified non-dualism. Hence, be aware of where you are at this stage of your life, and be aware of where you want to go, right? So let me finish with a beautiful story that, I always have great pleasure in reflecting on this story. And each time it gives me a different, a different view or a different vision, although the concept is the same. So it was a story that Ramakrishna Paramahamsa used to tell to all his disciples. He used to say that there was a big, huge sea, and lots of prayers used to happen there, and lots of gatherings used to happen on various religious festivals, and great crowds used to gather there. Now, on one of these occasions, two Pandits. Now, let me explain what the word Pandit means. Pandit does not mean, again, over a period of time, the word has been diluted in its meaning. Right? Nowadays, when the moment people say Pandit, it means somebody who does these pujas in the temple. Panditji. No. The true word comes from the Sanskrit word Pandita. That means a learned person or a learned scholar. That is why the English have taken this, the Western have taken this, and they use it. Oh, John Brooks is a great pundit in football. He's a great commentator. That doesn't mean John Brooks, just because he's known as a Pandit, is doing pujas in the temple, isn't it? So Pandits are learned scholars, right? But of course, over a period of time, people have associated this word Pandit with priests who are, acharyas in the temple who do pujas and all that. So use the word in the right context. You can call them, acharyas in the temple or whatever you want to. So there are one or two Pandits gathered there, and one or two scholars also came, and they began to discuss simple thing. Now I want you to think about this, right? They began to discuss whether the ocean is unfathomable or whether the ocean is fathomable. Can you understand the nature of the ocean, or can you not understand the nature of the ocean? Is it understandable, or is it beyond understanding? So the two Pandits and the two, scholars were arguing. Two schools of thought, always, Dvaitam, Advaitam, or Vishishtadvaitam, qualified. So people always fall into one of these categories, right? So you have to move out of the category into a non-categorized awakening. So discussions, whenever there are learned people around, are never ending. They always go round and round and round and round. They never go deep and deep and deep and deep. They go round and round and round and round. Then, one simple villager who was there, he said to them, look, I have been here, I've been listening to you for some time, right? And there seems to be no conclusion. It's been 2-3 days you guys are arguing about this, but I'm an ignorant man. Now, if you ask me, my answer would be, unless you swim inside the ocean, or inside the river, or inside the sea, you're not going to be able to say whether you understand it or not. So what is he talking about? He's talking about experience, right? So he says you cannot talk about something unless you've got the experience, right? And some time ago, when I spoke about, in my reflections, I spoke about sympathy and empathy. I made the difference. When is something referred to as sympathy, and when can something be referred to as empathy? Right? Remember that. Anyway, so the Pandits looked at him, the scholars looked at him and said, what are you talking about? You don't know anything that we are talking about. So don't come in and you don't interfere. You don't know anything about the scriptures. The guy said, look, I may not know the scriptures like you guys do. I may not be learned in the scriptures, but I know the ocean. And if you ask me the question, I can give you an answer, but you're not asking me. You are yourselves trying to answer the question which you yourself don't know the answer to. So, sometimes, you have to know when to ask a question, right? Because you have asked the question in the wrong time, or you ask the wrong question at the right time, then, it's trouble for you. So one of the scholars said, so what do you want us to do? How do you propose a solution to this? He said, go and jump in the river. I suggest you take a jump, go to the bottom, and then come back and tell me whether it's fathomable or not. So what do you think? The two scholars decided to jump, but they never came back. And Ramakrishna always used to say they never came back because they failed to understand that the deeper they go into the ocean, they become one with the ocean. The breathing stops and the body becomes one, it floats. And your body is essentially made of salt, and the ocean is salt. So the little salt gets merged with the big salt, and therefore, if you don't understand that, then the ocean will never be fathomable. If you understand that, then any ocean is fathomable. That's why they say you need an ocean of knowledge, because there's no difference between one and the other. So that's all. Again, I've spoken for quite a bit now, almost 1 hour, 20 minutes. So next week, from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, we will move to Chandogya Upanishad.